Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 60 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Los Angeles Kings, in which the Sharks have lost 3-0. This was the fourth and final game of the season series versus the Los Angeles Kings, and in the first three games of this one, it has gone rather well for the Sharks. They are a perfect 3-0. In a couple of those games, they just absolutely destroyed the Kings by a very wide margin, and so going into the game tonight, the Sharks were expected to be at the very least competitive, but likely be able to even close out a win and get that 4-0 season series sweep against the Kings. However, it would not be the first time that the Sharks against the Kings, when up 3-0 in a series, would be unable to close it out. Here tonight, the Sharks just didn't really look all that engaged into it. They had maybe a couple of chances, most of them coming from just a single player. That would be Tomas Hertl with the new contract sort of boost to his game, I guess you could say. And yet otherwise the Sharks were just kind of lifeless. There wasn't much doing, and while the Kings weren't just completely dominating or anything like that, as is to be expected considering the Kings, the lineup that they were icing, the fact that the Kings managed to pull out a relatively unscathed 3-0 victory is rather disappointing. On top of that, it makes it even weirder with the fact that just a couple of days ago that the Sharks were against the Florida Panthers, and while they did get outplayed by the Panthers, it still ended up being a relatively close score on the scoreboard. They only lost 3-2, and it actually went to overtime, so the Sharks managed a point. And so they went from playing against one of the league's best teams with the Panthers and bringing it to overtime and making it relatively close on the scoreboard to going against a Los Angeles Kings team that is missing essentially half of its main roster, and then they just get shut out 3-0. So it's really a tale of two teams between this night and just a couple of days ago. It is actually a very interesting quote by Eric Carlson earlier today, where he talked about how it felt as though the San Jose Sharks got into a trap when against better teams, that they would kind of crank it down defensively and not really play for an offensive game. I don't necessarily agree with that. I just think that the Sharks are worse than the Panthers, which is why they're defending more often than they're on the attack. But then what is the excuse here tonight? Because while the Kings are ahead of the Sharks in the standings, just based on injuries, the Sharks, I would say, were icing a more competitive and better lineup here tonight, and yet they were defending most of the game anyway. And while they were doing a pretty good job on the defensive side of things, they didn't give up a ton of chances here tonight. There was essentially zero offensive game, bar those couple of chances that I mentioned earlier. On to the game itself. In the first period, I would say the Kings were the better team there, and that's kind of a theme of here tonight. Like I said, not completely tilted towards the Kings side. I would say it was maybe 60-40, 65-35, something like that, but in the end, it was the Kings coming out on top, though the first period was, of course, scoreless. Going into the second period is where Los Angeles finally got some goals on the board, and the Sharks just kind of watched it happen. The Kings would get a goal from Kopitar and to put themselves up 1-0, and then another would put them up 2-0, and that would be the score at the end of the second period. Going into the third period, there was a chance for the San Jose Sharks to maybe make something happen, but the third period ended up potentially being the most boring period of the entire game. There was maybe like one chance for the Sharks in the entire thing, and it would end up just being an Adrian Kempe empty net goal pretty early on from when the Sharks actually pulled the goaltender to put the Kings up 3-0 and end that game. So the Sharks just zero offense here, which is unusual considering the offense that they generated in the first three games against the Los Angeles Kings, but I guess unlucky or something like that if you want to paint it there. On to the players to talk about. We have the first line of Meier, Couture, and Dahlin not really generating much of anything. Dahlin, after that pretty solid game that he had a couple of games ago, he's kind of gone back to where he was before his injury, where he's just not really being a super effective player on this first line. I don't know if that's necessarily dragging down the other two players or if the other two players aren't looking particularly good, but Couture and Meier, while Meier did have a couple of chances, he also had a very nice look where he tried to flip the puck over Cal Peterson, and it was going to go in if not for the active stick and the hand-eye coordination of Kings defenseman Sean Durzi. But besides that, there wasn't a ton doing with this first line, and that was rather disappointing to see, especially when you think back all the way to the start of this season. Remember the first few games of the year, the Sharks actually won the first 4 games of the year. Meier, Couture, and Dahlin as a line was dominant and was potentially one of the best lines in the entire league statistically. Now, nobody believed that that particular stat would last. Obviously, they dropped back down to earth, and then other fantastic first lines around the league like Colorado and Boston would surpass past them, but it seemed as though that they could run with a strong first line. But besides after those first 10 games and then occasionally a few games here or there scattered across the season, this line has never really managed to recapture that magic, and Meyer has had more success with other two line mates. On with the second line, we had Barabanov and Hertl once again joined by John Leonard, and I guess Bob Booner was thinking the same exact thing as me at the end of the last game against the Panthers, that John Leonard was kind of thrown to the wolves there. He was up against the league's best team, or one of the league's best teams, and so he didn't really get an opportunity to show what he can actually do on that second line because they were just completely dominated pretty much in their own zone. So he gets another opportunity on the second line here tonight against a Kings squad that, like I have already mentioned multiple times, is icing a pretty weak lineup thanks to a ton of injuries on the front and back end, and Leonard didn't really jump at this opportunity. While Hertl did generate a couple of great chances for himself, he had a breakaway that probably could have ended up being a penalty shot. He had a great breakaway that I believe it was shorthanded off of a beautiful pass from Erik Carlson, but besides that, when it comes to his own solo efforts, while it wasn't a terrible game for this line, I'd say Barabanov and eventually Leonard would actually get booted down to the fourth line and Balcers would step up back to the second line. While it wasn't a terrible game for these players, they had a couple of chances. It wasn't anything super dominant otherwise, and so it was really just Hertl's couple of chances that really stood out positively. When it comes to the third line, Cogliano, Bonino, and Nieto were once again reunited, the dreaded third line for the San Jose Sharks. And of course, when I say dreaded third line, I don't mean dreaded for the opposing team, who now has to deal with such stalwarts defensively. I mean dreaded for the Sharks themselves and for Sharks fans who have to watch this line put up zero offense and also be very bad in the defensive zone. They've still managed to put together at least 40, potentially even 50 games as a line together, and I wouldn't even be surprised if they're one of, if not the worst line in the entire league as a whole. I remember there was a statistic, it was from maybe a month ago or so, maybe even more than that, so maybe that has changed at this point, but this was the line that had given up the most goals against that even strength. I think it was per 60 minutes in the entire league. Not a good look, and it continues that pain. On the fourth line, there was a bit of an interesting look to this line early on in this game, though that obviously ended up changing when Gregor and Balcers would join Scott Reedy on the fourth line. So finally we get a game without Viel or Gadjevich. We get a bit more of a skilled fourth line here, Gregor and Balcers. Reedy not necessarily super skilled, but he was a strong player at the AHL level this year, so not necessarily a complete pylon, I would say. And the fourth line, they had a couple of good looks. Gregor seemed to have some jump in his game early on in this one. He was the player in the first period who was maybe the most impressive for the San Jose Sharks, at least early on in the first period. He had a couple of chances when nobody else for the Sharks was doing pretty much anything, so that was good to see. Once Balcers was promoted back to the second line and Leonard was dropped down to the fourth line, it kind of disappeared a bit, I would say. Maybe you could really blame Leonard for that, but I would also say Gregor kind of fell off a bit as this game did go on, but still nice to see him contribute a few chances here or there after he did get healthy scratched. I talked about a few games ago that I wouldn't give too much credit to Bob Booner for the rebound game that Dallin had, but you can give credit him for the rebound. You can give credit to him for the rebound game that Gregor had tonight. On to the defensive side of things, one player who I really want to talk about here would actually be Jacob Middleton. I don't know if he's trying to drop his value moving up to the trade deadline because he really wants to remain a San Jose Sharks, or maybe on the opposite side he's trying so hard that he's almost trying too hard and he's overthinking it, and so he's making these bad plays. But Middleton was just a disaster here tonight, I would say, multiple times, just getting beat, losing races, losing battles, which, I'm not surprised he's necessarily losing races because he's never been the fastest defenseman, but losing battles, since he is a pretty strong guy, is extremely disappointing. On this Philip Deneau goal, the second goal for the Kings, that was his man that he was supposed to cover, and while there was a big rebound for James Reimer that you don't want to see, and if that rebound didn't exist, obviously there would not have been a goal here, you still want to see Middleton be able to outmuscle the guy heading towards the net and prevent this sort of rebound shot from happening, and it just doesn't end up being the case. So a very difficult game from Jacob Middleton. And since we just saw yesterday the trade from the Montreal Canadiens to the Florida Panthers for Ben Sherratt, he got not only a first-round pick in return, but also a decent prospect and a fourth-round pick. The sort of hype around what potential value that Jacob Middleton could bring was at a pretty high point, at least for myself. I had been predicting that he could get a third, maybe a second-round pick in return for his services, but suddenly it seemed like a bit more reasonable that the Sharks could fetch a first round pick to a desperate team. But with these past couple of games where Middleton has just looked completely lost and a lot more like he had looked last season and just every point prior to this year, hopefully there were no scouts watching tonight, basically, is what I will say. When it comes to his pair mate, Erik Carlson, Carlson kind of had a similar game to we had in the previous one against the Florida Panthers. He contributed on the offensive side a few times. Like I mentioned earlier, he had that absolutely marvelous pass to Tomas Hertl shorthanded to try and get that breakaway goal that Hertl ended up getting robbed on. Very akin to the 2017 playoffs with the Ottawa Senators, where he had that beautiful pass to Mike Hoffman, who actually finished with that goal on that play. So that ended up being like a goal of the year, goal of all time type of move. This one could have also been right up there. Didn't end up happening, but so he was there offensively, but on the defensive side of things did leave a bit to be desired. I would say it wasn't disastrous because generally I thought that the Sharks were not giving up a ton of chances against. But the thing is, especially when you take into account that quote that Erik Carlson had before the games of, oh, well, we get into this trap against good teams of playing defensively. Well, it seemed as though Carlson fell into that own trap himself because he played in the defensive zone a lot here tonight. When it comes to the other defensemen, I found it particularly interesting that Vlasic ended up with just over 12 minutes here tonight, so his ice time continues to drop. Basically, he's at a point where he's anything but healthy scratched at this point. He seems to just continue to steal a spot in the lineup because of the fact that he is named Market Ward Vlasic and he has a massive contract. I don't know if there's maybe some sort of veteran presence angle to it as well, but he wasn't terrible this game, he wasn't good this game, and that's basically been the case with Vlasic. He's either, here at like an average level, or he's all the way down here. It's rare that you say, wow, Vlasic, what a great game from him, which is obviously in stark contrast to where he was a few years ago, but that's just the new Vlasic. When it comes to the goaltending situation, James Reimer had an pretty good game, I would say. I can't say it was a fantastic game, even though he made a few nice saves in this one. Just because of that second goal kind of rubs me the wrong way. Obviously, if he doesn't let in this second goal, it's not as though the Sharks actually win this game, because the Sharks gave him literally 0 goal support, so they would still end up losing with the 1-0, or I guess 2-0 shutout, but still, that was a pretty significant rebound to give up, so I can't give him, passing marks, perfect flying colors type of situation, but he was still one of the better Sharks players here tonight. Going into the next game, it'll be interesting to see whether or not Zach Sawchenko gets the start. It seems as though the word from Bob Booner is that Sawchenko will indeed get that start, but that could be a bit of a problem because that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow when they will take on the Colorado Avalanche. The reason that I've been saying over these past couple of games that the Florida Panthers are not necessarily the best team in the league, and I've had to say one of the best teams, is because the Avalanche as a team also exist, and they could very well be that best team in the league. And so putting Zach Sawchenko, who has looked pretty good in the limited uses he has had this season, but putting him in against that fantastic offensive juggernaut like the Avalanche could be kind of throwing him to the wolves. I guess we'll see what ends up happening. It could be a situation where if he performs well, it could be an insanely massive confidence booster, but I could also foresee a future where he ends up letting in 4 goals in the first period and gets either pulled for Reimer, is forced to stick in so that Reimer gets the rest, and then his confidence is absolutely shattered. So on that note, we'll see how it goes. Class dismissed.